The leather-bound journal felt ice cold in my trembling hands, its familiar purple cover bringing back memories of Christmas morning 3 years ago when I'd given it to my sister Emma for her 16th birthday. She'd hugged it to her chest and promised to write in it every day, documenting all her dreams and secrets. What I never imagined was that I'd be holding it again under these circumstances, hidden behind my husband's winter coats in the back corner of our walk-in closet, with dust particles dancing in the afternoon sunlight streaming through our bedroom window. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Jessica Chen, and until 20 minutes ago, I thought I knew everything about my life. I'm 28 years old, married to David for 4 years, and we live in a cozy craftsman house in suburban Portland where the coffee shops outnumber the gas stations and everyone seems to know everyone else's business. I work as a graphic designer for a local marketing firm, spending my days creating advertisements for everything from organic pet food to sustainable yoga mats. It's the kind of life that looks perfect from the outside, complete with matching throw pillows and a carefully curated Instagram feed that showcases our weekend hiking adventures and date nights at farm-to-table restaurants. But perfect lives have a way of unraveling when you least expect them to, and mine began falling apart the moment I decided to surprise my husband by organizing his closet while he was at his monthly poker game with the guys. David had been complaining for weeks about not being able to find his good dress shirts, and I thought I'd do something nice by color coordinating everything, and maybe even installing some of those fancy wooden hangers I'd been eyeing at Target. It was supposed to be a simple gesture of love, the kind of thoughtful surprise that keeps marriages strong and social media feeds full of #blessed content. Instead, I found myself staring at Emma's diary, the sister who had vanished without a trace 8 months ago on a Tuesday morning in March, when the cherry blossoms were just starting to bloom throughout our neighborhood. The sister whose disappearance had torn our family apart and left me questioning everything I thought I knew about trust, loyalty, and the people we love most in this world. The day Emma disappeared started like any other ordinary Tuesday in our household. I remember because I had been rushing around that morning, trying to get ready for an important client presentation, while simultaneously packing David's lunch and searching for my favorite earrings that had somehow migrated from my jewelry box to the bathroom counter. Emma had been staying with us for the past 6 months while she finished her senior year of high school, arrangement that had come about after our parents decided to relocate to Phoenix for Dad's job transfer. Rather than uproot Emma during her final year, they'd asked if she could live with David and me until graduation, and we'd eagerly agreed. Having Emma in our house had brought an energy and liveliness that David and I hadn't realized we were missing. She'd transformed our spare bedroom into a teenage sanctuary complete with fairy lights strung across the ceiling, Polaroid photos covering every available surface, and enough skincare products to stock a small pharmacy. Her laughter echoed through our halls during late-night phone calls with friends, and our kitchen table became command central for her various school projects and college application essays. She'd even convinced David to help her with her calculus homework, something that initially terrified him, but ultimately became their special bonding time every Thursday evening. That Tuesday morning, Emma had seemed perfectly normal as she sat at our kitchen island eating cereal and scrolling through her phone, her long black hair still messy from sleep, and her face makeup free in that effortless way that only teenagers can pull off. She was wearing her favorite oversized sweater, the cream-colored one with tiny embroidered flowers that she'd bought during our shopping trip to the mall the weekend before. I remember teasing her about wearing the same sweater 3 days in a row, and she'd rolled her eyes in that dramatic fashion she'd perfected, informing me that it was her comfort sweater, and that I clearly didn't understand the emotional significance of comfort clothes. We'd had our usual morning banter about her plans for the day. She mentioned having a chemistry test that she wasn't prepared for, and complained about her English teacher's impossible expectations for their latest essay assignment. David had offered to quiz her on chemical formulas during breakfast, but she'd waved him off, claiming that cramming never worked for her anyway, and that she'd rather face the test with a clear mind than a stressed one. It was such a quintessentially Emma response, this mixture of teenage drama and unexpected wisdom that always caught us off guard. I'd grabbed my coffee and given her a quick hug before heading out the door, reminding her to text me after her test, and promising that we'd order pizza for dinner if she'd had a particularly rough day. She'd smiled and promised to let me know how everything went, and that was the last conversation we ever had. The last time I saw her sitting in our kitchen, the last time I heard her voice, The last time, everything in my world made sense. When I arrived home from work that evening around 6:30, I'd expected to find Emma sprawled across the living room couch with her homework spread everywhere, probably complaining about how unfair her teachers were, while simultaneously texting multiple friends about weekend plans. Instead, I found an empty house that felt strangely hollow, as if the very air had changed in her absence. Her backpack wasn't by the front door where she always dropped it, her shoes weren't scattered across the entryway, and the kitchen showed no signs of her usual after-school snacking routine. Initially, I wasn't worried. Emma was 17 and had an active social life that sometimes involved spontaneous trips to friends' houses or last-minute study groups at the local coffee shop. She was generally good about texting when her plans changed, but teenagers aren't known for their consistent communication skills, and I figured she'd gotten distracted by something more interesting than checking in with her boring older sister. I sent her a casual text asking about the chemistry test and what she wanted for dinner, then started preparing a simple pasta dish that could easily be reheated whenever she decided to show up. By 8 o'clock, my casual concern had transformed into genuine worry. Emma always texted back within an hour, usually much sooner, and her phone seemed to be going straight to voicemail when I called. I reached out to her best friend Madison, who seemed surprised to hear that Emma wasn't home and mentioned that she hadn't seen her since lunch period at school. According to Madison, Emma had seemed normal during their shared English class and had even made plans to study together for their upcoming history exam on Thursday. David arrived home around 8:30 to find me pacing the kitchen while calling everyone in Emma's contact list that I could think of. He immediately went into problem-solving mode, suggesting that we drive around to her usual hangout spots before jumping to any worst-case scenarios. We spent the next 2 hours driving through our neighborhood and the surrounding areas, checking the coffee shops where she liked to study, the park where she sometimes went to read, and even the mall where she'd occasionally meet friends for impromptu shopping trips. When we returned home empty-handed at nearly 11 o'clock, the gravity of the situation finally hit us both. This wasn't Emma being irresponsible or forgetting to check in. This was something else entirely, something that made my stomach churn with a fear I'd never experienced before. We called our parents in Phoenix, waking them up with news that sent them into immediate panic mode. Within an hour, they were booking the earliest possible flight back to Portland, while simultaneously trying to think of any detail that might help us understand where Emma could have gone. The police were surprisingly unhelpful during those first crucial hours. Because Emma was 17 and had no history of running away or getting into trouble, they initially treated her disappearance as a typical teenage rebellion situation. The responding officer, a middle-aged man with kind eyes but an obviously overworked demeanor, explained that most missing teenager cases resolve themselves within 48 hours when kids come home after spending time with friends or boyfriends that their families didn't know about. But Emma wasn't most teenagers. She was responsible, communicative, and deeply connected to our family, despite the typical adolescent eye-rolling and complaints about our house rules. She'd never disappeared before, never given us reason to doubt her whereabouts, and never made decisions that would cause this level of worry and panic. The officer took our information and promised to file a report, but I could see in his expression that he was mentally categorizing this as another case of teenage drama that would resolve itself by morning. The next 72 hours passed in a blur of phone calls, search parties, and growing desperation. Our parents arrived and immediately took charge of coordinating with local authorities, while David and I continued reaching out to anyone who might have information about Emma's whereabouts. Her school counselor confirmed that she'd attended all her morning classes but hadn't shown up for her afternoon chemistry test, the one she'd been worried about during breakfast. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The last confirmed sighting was from her friend Jake, who'd seen her leaving the school building around lunchtime, but hadn't thought to ask where she was going. As the days turned into weeks, our house transformed into a command center for the search effort. Our dining room table disappeared under stacks of missing person flyers, maps marking areas that had been searched, and contact information for various law enforcement agencies and volunteer organizations. The living room became a meeting space for the dedicated group of neighbors and friends who'd committed themselves to helping find Emma, and our kitchen constantly buzzed with activity as people brought food and offered whatever support they could provide. The media attention was both a blessing and a curse. Local news stations picked up Emma's story, broadcasting her photo and details about her disappearance during their evening broadcasts. Social media campaigns spread her image far beyond our immediate community, reaching thousands of people who shared and reshared her information in hopes that someone, somewhere, might have seen something that could lead us to her. But the constant attention also brought its share of false leads, conspiracy theories, and well-meaning but ultimately unhelpful suggestions from strangers who thought they knew what had happened to my sister. David was incredible during those first few weeks, taking time off work to help coordinate search efforts, and providing the kind of steady, logical thinking that I desperately needed when my emotions threatened to overwhelm me completely. He organized volunteer schedules, maintained spreadsheets tracking which areas had been searched and when, and served as the primary contact person for law enforcement updates. His natural leadership abilities and calm demeanor made him invaluable during a crisis that seemed to grow more complicated and heartbreaking with each passing day. The investigation revealed frustratingly little concrete information. Emma's phone had been turned off or destroyed sometime around 2 o'clock that Tuesday afternoon, roughly an hour after she'd left school. Security cameras at various businesses showed her walking through downtown Portland, apparently alone and not appearing distressed, but the trail went cold after she passed a busy intersection near the waterfront district. Her bank account showed no activity, her social media accounts remained untouched, and none of her friends or acquaintances reported any unusual conversations or concerning behavior in the days leading up to her disappearance. The police expanded their investigation to include potential online predators, though Emma's internet history showed no evidence of inappropriate communications or risky online behavior. They examined her academic records for signs of stress or problems at school, but her teachers consistently described her as a bright, engaged student who seemed happy and well-adjusted. They even looked into the possibility that she'd been struggling with mental health issues that we weren't aware of. But everyone who knew Emma described her as emotionally stable and excited about her upcoming graduation and college plans. As spring turned into summer, the intense daily search efforts gradually gave way to a more sustained but less frantic ongoing investigation. The volunteer search parties became weekly rather than daily events. The media coverage shifted to periodic updates rather than daily stories. And the painful reality began to set in that we might never know what happened to Emma during those crucial hours after she left school on that Tuesday in March. Our parents eventually returned to Phoenix, though Mom called several times each day for updates and Dad flew back every few weeks to check on the investigation's progress. The spare bedroom that had been Emma's sanctuary remained exactly as she'd left it, with her clothes still folded in the dresser drawers and her school books stacked neatly on the desk where she'd been working on college applications. David and I couldn't bring ourselves to change anything about the room, holding on to the hope that she'd walk through our front door one day and need everything to be exactly where she'd left it. The emotional toll of Emma's disappearance affected every aspect of our lives. My work performance suffered as I struggled to concentrate on design projects that seemed trivial compared to the desperate search for my sister. David's usually optimistic outlook became more subdued, and our relationship faced stresses that neither of us had anticipated when we'd eagerly agreed to let Emma live with us. We still loved each other deeply, but the constant worry and uncertainty created an underlying tension that colored even our most ordinary interactions. Sleep became elusive for both of us. I'd lie awake at night constructing elaborate scenarios about where Emma might be and what might have happened to her, while David would spend hours researching missing person cases and potential investigation strategies on his laptop. Our bedroom conversations shifted from discussions about weekend plans and work projects to updates about search efforts and theories about Emma's disappearance. Even when we managed to fall asleep, nightmares and anxiety-driven insomnia meant that most mornings found us exhausted and emotionally drained. The 6-month mark of Emma's disappearance hit particularly hard. Local media ran retrospective pieces about her case, interviewing our family and highlighting the lack of progress in the investigation. The police detective assigned to her case, A compassionate woman named Detective Rodriguez, who'd become almost like family to us, admitted that leads had essentially dried up, and that they were hoping new information might surface from the renewed media attention. But privately, I could see in her expression that she was no longer optimistic about finding Emma alive. By the time we reached the 8th-month anniversary of that terrible Tuesday in March, I'd developed coping mechanisms that allowed me to function in daily life while carrying the constant weight of not knowing what had happened to my sister. I'd returned to work full-time and was slowly rebuilding my professional reputation after months of distracted performance. David and I had started couples counseling to help us navigate the grief and uncertainty that had become permanent residents in our marriage. We'd even begun discussing the possibility of trying to have children, thinking that new life and hope might help balance the loss and fear that dominated our emotional landscape. Which brings me back to this afternoon, standing in our bedroom closet with Emma's diary in my hands, and my entire world shifting beneath my feet once again. I'd been humming while organizing David's shirts, feeling unusually optimistic about life for the first time in months. The weather was beautiful, our relationship felt stronger after several productive counseling sessions, and I'd even caught myself laughing genuinely at a colleague's joke during our morning meeting. For a brief moment, it had seemed like we might actually be learning to live with the uncertainty of Emma's disappearance. The diary had been wedged behind a stack of sweaters that David rarely wore, pushed far enough back that it was barely visible unless you were specifically looking for something in that corner of the closet. I almost missed it entirely, but a flash of purple caught my eye as I was reorganizing his winter clothes, and my breath caught in my throat as I recognized the distinctive cover that I'd carefully selected for Emma's birthday gift. My hands shook as I pulled it free from its hiding place, dust motes dancing in the afternoon sunlight that streamed through our bedroom window. The leather was slightly worn at the edges where Emma's fingers had habitually traced patterns while she thought, and I could see that the small brass clasp was tarnished from use. It was definitely her diary, the one that had disappeared along with her on that Tuesday morning 8 months ago, the one that police had specifically asked about during their investigation of her room. Standing there in my husband's closet, holding physical evidence that my missing sister had been in our house after her disappearance, I felt reality shift in a way that I'd never experienced before. Every assumption I'd made about Emma's case, every theory I'd constructed about what might have happened to her, every moment of trust and security in my marriage suddenly became questionable. The diary felt heavier than it should have, weighted with implications that I wasn't sure I was ready to confront. The logical part of my mind immediately began searching for innocent explanations. Maybe Emma had hidden it there before she disappeared, planning to retrieve it later for some reason I couldn't understand. Maybe David had found it somewhere and brought it home, intending to give it to the police but forgetting in the chaos of those early weeks. Maybe there was some perfectly reasonable explanation that would make sense once I asked him about it. But even as I tried to construct these alternative narratives, a cold certainty was settling in my stomach. The diary had been carefully hidden, pushed far back behind clothes that David rarely accessed, in a location where it would never be found during normal daily activities. This wasn't a forgotten item or a misplaced piece of evidence. This was deliberate concealment, and the implications of that realization made my knees weak enough that I had to sit down on our bedroom floor. I opened the diary with trembling fingers, immediately recognizing Emma's distinctive handwriting with its carefully formed letters and occasional doodles in the margins. The entries were dated, starting from shortly after she'd moved in with us, and continuing right up until the day before her disappearance. As I flipped through the pages, I could see her personality shining through in every entry, her observations about school and friends mixed with deeper thoughts about her future and her feelings about living away from our parents. The early entries were exactly what I'd expected from a teenage diary, full of complaints about homework and excitement about weekend plans. She wrote about her appreciation for David and me, mentioning how grateful she was that we'd opened our home to her, and how much she enjoyed feeling like part of a real adult household. She documented her college application process, her worries about standardized tests, and her excitement about the possibility of studying journalism at the University of Oregon. But as I continued reading, the tone of the entries began to shift in subtle ways that made my heart race. Emma started mentioning feeling uncomfortable in certain situations, though she was vague about the specifics. She wrote about sensing that someone was watching her, about feeling like her privacy was being violated in ways she couldn't quite articulate. The handwriting became more hurried, more anxious, and I could see erasure marks where she'd started to write something but then changed her mind. The final entry was dated the day before her disappearance, and reading it felt like being punched in the stomach while simultaneously having the ground disappear beneath my feet. Emma's usually neat handwriting was shaky, almost frantic, and the words seemed to pour out in a stream of consciousness that revealed a level of fear and desperation that broke my heart. She wrote about discovering something that had shattered her sense of safety in our house, something that made her question everything she thought she knew about the people around her. She mentioned finding evidence of behavior that made her feel sick and violated, though she was cryptic about the specific details. Most devastating of all, she wrote about her growing realization that the person she'd trusted and looked up to was not who she thought he was, and that she was afraid of what might happen if she confronted the situation directly. The entry ended with a plan. Emma had decided to gather more evidence before taking action, wanting to be absolutely certain about what she'd discovered before making accusations that could destroy lives and relationships. She wrote about feeling torn between protecting herself and protecting our family, between speaking up about something horrible and keeping quiet to avoid causing pain to people she loved. The final line, written in handwriting so shaky it was barely legible, stated that she would decide what to do after her chemistry test the next day, after she'd had time to think through all the implications of what she'd learned. Sitting on our bedroom floor with Emma's diary open in my lap, I realized that my sister hadn't run away or been abducted by a stranger. She'd discovered something in our house, something involving David, something serious enough to make her plan some kind of action that she never got the chance to take. The timeline made terrible sense now. She'd attended her morning classes but never showed up for her afternoon chemistry test because something had happened between lunchtime and 2 o'clock that Tuesday, something that had prevented her from returning to school and ultimately led to her disappearance. The sound of David's car pulling into our driveway sent a jolt of terror through my entire body. He was home early from his poker game, probably because someone had canceled, or because he'd had a run of bad luck and decided to call it an early night. In a few minutes he'd walk through our front door expecting to find his loving wife, probably planning to tell me about his evening, and maybe suggest watching a movie together before bed. Instead, he'd find me sitting on our bedroom floor with evidence that connected him to my sister's disappearance, evidence that raised questions I was terrified to have answered. I closed the diary and clutched it against my chest, my mind racing through possibilities and implications that I couldn't fully process. Whatever Emma had discovered about David, whatever had made her feel unsafe and violated in our own home, had somehow led to her disappearance 8 months ago. The man I'd married, the man I'd shared a bed with every night since Emma vanished, the man who'd helped coordinate search efforts and comfort our devastated family, knew something about what had happened to her. The front door opened downstairs, and I heard David's familiar voice calling out a greeting. In a few moments he'd come upstairs to find me, probably expecting me to ask about his poker game and maybe show him the progress I'd made organizing his closet. The normalcy of that expectation felt surreal given what I'd just discovered, and I realized that everything about our relationship, our marriage, and our life together was now cast in a completely different light. As his footsteps started up the stairs, I made a split-second decision that would change everything. I slipped Emma's diary into the back of my own dresser drawer, beneath clothing that David never had reason to access, and quickly moved to our bathroom to splash water on my face and try to compose myself. When he appeared in our bedroom doorway, I was sitting on our bed trying to look casually tired rather than completely devastated by the discovery that was now burning a hole in my dresser drawer. The next few hours passed in a haze of forced normalcy that felt like the most difficult performance of my life. David told me about his poker game, mentioning that he'd broken even and that one of his friends had shared funny stories about his new puppy. I responded with appropriate interest and comments, all while studying his face for any signs of deception or guilt that I might have missed during our 4 years of marriage. He seemed exactly like himself, warm and affectionate and completely normal, which somehow made the situation even more terrifying. When we finally went to bed, I lay awake listening to David's steady breathing beside me and trying to process what I'd learned. Somewhere in our house, my husband was hiding evidence related to my sister's disappearance. The diary suggested that Emma had discovered something about him that made her feel unsafe. Something serious enough that she'd been planning to take action before she vanished. The man sleeping peacefully next to me, the man I'd trusted completely and loved deeply, was connected to the most devastating event in my family's history. As dawn light began filtering through our bedroom curtains, I realized that my life had been permanently divided into before and after this discovery. Before finding Emma's diary, I was a woman grieving her missing sister while trying to rebuild her marriage and her sense of security in the world. After finding the diary, I was a woman who understood that the person closest to her might be responsible for her sister's disappearance, and that everything she thought she knew about love, trust, and safety had been built on lies. The question now was what to do with this knowledge, how to investigate further without putting myself in danger, and whether I had the courage to uncover the full truth about what had happened to Emma, even if that truth destroyed everything I thought I knew about my life. The next morning arrived with a cruel normalcy that felt like a mockery of my shattered world. David's alarm went off at exactly 7:15, just like every other weekday for the past 4 years of our marriage. He rolled over and kissed my forehead with the same gentle affection he'd shown me yesterday morning, when I was still a woman who trusted her husband completely. The coffee maker started its familiar gurgling at 7:20, programmed the night before with the same precision that characterized every aspect of our carefully organized life together. I watched David move through his morning routine with new eyes, cataloging every gesture and expression for signs of deception that I might have overlooked during our years together. When he hummed while shaving, was it the contentment of a loving husband or the satisfaction of someone who believed his secrets were safe? When he asked about my plans for the day, was it genuine interest or subtle surveillance? Every interaction felt loaded with hidden meaning, every casual comment potentially significant, in ways I was only beginning to understand. The irony wasn't lost on me that Emma's diary was hidden just 20 feet away in my dresser drawer, while David brushed his teeth and selected his tie for another ordinary day at the architectural firm where he'd worked since graduating college. He moved through our bedroom with the easy familiarity of someone who belonged there, completely unaware that his wife now knew he was hiding evidence related to her sister's disappearance. The normalcy of it all felt surreal, like watching a movie where the audience knows the killer's identity but the protagonist remains obliviously vulnerable. I forced myself to maintain our usual morning conversation, discussing weekend plans and grocery lists while internally screaming at the disconnect between our surface-level domesticity and the terrifying reality that Emma's diary had revealed. David mentioned wanting to try that new hiking trail we'd seen featured in the local magazine, and I nodded enthusiastically while wondering if this was how he'd acted in the days immediately following Emma's disappearance, maintaining perfect normalcy while knowing exactly what had happened to her. After David left for work, I called in sick to my job for the first time in over 2 years. The lie came easily, perhaps because emotional devastation felt like a legitimate illness that deserved acknowledgement and recovery time. My boss expressed genuine concern and told me to take whatever time I needed, mentioning that I'd seemed stressed lately and that everyone deserved mental health days occasionally. If only she knew that my stress had just multiplied exponentially, and that what I needed wasn't a day off but answers to questions that could destroy my entire existence. Once I was certain David's commute had taken him safely away from our neighborhood, I retrieved Emma's diary from its hiding place and settled into our living room with a cup of coffee that I knew I wouldn't be able to drink. The familiar purple leather felt warm in my hands, as if it contained some essence of my sister that had been waiting all these months to be discovered. I opened to the first entry and began reading chronologically, determined to understand the full scope of what Emma had experienced in our house and what had ultimately led to her disappearance. The early entries painted a picture of a teenager genuinely happy about her living situation with David and me. Emma wrote extensively about her gratitude for our hospitality and her excitement about finishing high school in a stable, supportive environment. She described our house as feeling more like a real home than the temporary accommodations she'd experienced during our parents' relocation process, and she expressed particular appreciation for the independence we'd given her, while still providing appropriate guidance and structure. Reading about Emma's initial impressions of David was particularly heartbreaking given what I now suspected about his true nature. She described him as the kind of brother-in-law she'd always hoped to have, someone who treated her with respect and genuine interest rather than tolerance or obligation. She wrote about their Thursday evening calculus sessions with enthusiasm, mentioning how patient he was with her questions and how he made complex mathematical concepts feel manageable and even interesting. Emma's entries also revealed details about her daily life that I hadn't fully appreciated while it was happening. She wrote about the small ways David and I had made her feel welcome, from stocking her favorite cereal to remembering her preference for extra foam in her coffee drinks. She documented her growing sense of belonging in our household, describing how natural it felt to have family dinners and casual conversations about school and future plans. Reading her words made me realize how much joy Emma had brought to our lives, and how devastating her loss had been for reasons beyond just the mystery of her disappearance. But as I continued reading through the months leading up to her vanishing, subtle changes in tone began to emerge that made my stomach tighten with dread. Around the 4-month mark of her stay with us, Emma started mentioning small incidents that had made her feel uncomfortable in ways she couldn't quite articulate. She wrote about feeling like someone had been in her room while she was at school, though nothing was obviously disturbed or missing. She described a growing sense of being watched during her private moments, particularly when she was studying alone in the evening or getting ready for bed. Initially, Emma seemed to dismiss these feelings as typical teenage paranoia or stress related to college applications and academic pressure. She wrote about trying to convince herself that she was imagining things, that living in a new environment was making her hypersensitive to normal household sounds and activities. But the entries revealed her growing certainty that something was genuinely wrong, that her discomfort was based on real threats rather than adolescent imagination. The first concrete incident Emma documented occurred about 3 months before her disappearance. She'd been taking a shower when she heard what sounded like footsteps in her bedroom, followed by the soft click of her door closing. When she finished showering and checked her room, everything appeared normal, but she noticed that her laptop was open to a different screen than she'd left it on. Emma wrote about feeling violated and frightened, but also confused because nothing was missing, and she couldn't prove that anyone had actually been in her room. This incident was followed by several others that followed a similar pattern. Emma would return from school or wake up in the morning to find small signs that someone had been through her belongings. Her dresser drawers would be slightly different than she'd left them, her desk chair would be turned at an angle she didn't remember, or her phone would be moved from where she was certain she'd placed it. The violations were subtle enough that she questioned her own memory and perception, but consistent enough that she became increasingly anxious about her privacy and safety in our house. Reading these entries filled me with rage and heartbreak that made it difficult to continue turning pages. My innocent 17-year-old sister had been systematically stalked and violated in what should have been her safe haven, the place where she was supposed to feel protected and supported during a vulnerable transition period in her life. The fact that these violations had occurred under my own roof, while I remained completely oblivious to Emma's growing fear and distress, made me feel complicit in whatever had ultimately happened to her. Emma's attempts to understand and address the situation revealed her maturity and thoughtfulness, even in the face of genuine terror. She began keeping detailed records of the incidents, noting dates and times and specific details about what had been disturbed. She experimented with subtle ways of detecting intrusion, such as placing small objects in specific positions or taking photos of her room before leaving for school. These makeshift security measures confirmed her suspicions that someone was regularly accessing her space during her absence. The diary entries also revealed Emma's internal struggle about whether to confide in David and me about what was happening. She wrote extensively about not wanting to cause problems in our household or seem ungrateful for our hospitality by making accusations she couldn't definitively prove. She worried about being perceived as a dramatic teenager who was creating problems where none existed, particularly given how happy and stable our family dynamic had seemed on the surface. Emma's consideration for our feelings and her reluctance to disrupt our lives made her victimization even more tragic. She was being systematically violated by someone in our household, yet she prioritized our comfort and peace of mind over her own safety and well-being. Reading about her internal debate regarding whether to speak up made me realize how many victims of abuse and harassment remain silent not because they don't recognize the severity of their situation, but because they've been conditioned to prioritize other people's feelings over their own legitimate need for protection and justice. The timeline in Emma's diary corresponded with a period when I'd been particularly busy at work, managing a demanding client who required frequent evening meetings and weekend availability. During those months, I'd often arrived home late to find Emma already in her room doing homework, and I'd assumed her increasing tendency to stay upstairs was related to academic pressure rather than fear. David had frequently been the one to handle dinner preparations and check in with Emma about her day, a division of labor that I'd appreciated at the time but now viewed with growing horror. Emma's entries from this period revealed that David had been unusually attentive to her schedule and activities during those months when I was frequently absent. He'd ask detailed questions about her school day, her plans with friends, and her homework assignments. Emma initially interpreted this attention as kindness and genuine interest, but she gradually began to feel that his questions were too specific and frequent to be casual conversation. She wrote about sensing that he was gathering information about her routine for purposes she couldn't understand, but that made her increasingly uncomfortable. The most disturbing entries detailed Emma's growing realization that David was using the information he gathered to time his intrusions into her privacy. She noticed that her room was most likely to be disturbed on days when she'd mentioned having after-school activities or study sessions that would keep her away from the house for extended periods. Her belongings were most frequently searched when I was working late and wouldn't be home until after dinner, leaving David with unsupervised access to her space and possessions. Emma's documentation of these patterns revealed a level of calculation and premeditation that made David's behavior seem even more sinister. This wasn't impulsive boundary crossing or casual nosiness, but systematic stalking that required planning and careful attention to timing. The methodical nature of his violations suggested experience and comfort with this type of behavior, raising terrifying questions about whether Emma was his first victim or simply the most recent in a longer pattern of predatory conduct. As Emma's fear and paranoia intensified, she began taking more aggressive measures to protect her privacy and gather evidence of the intrusions. She started hiding important items in locations outside her bedroom, including keeping her diary in her school locker rather than at home. She experimented with makeshift alarm systems, such as placing tape across her doorframe in ways that would be disturbed if someone entered her room while she was gone. She even began varying her daily routine unpredictably, hoping to catch the intruder off guard or at least make their planning more difficult. These defensive measures revealed Emma's intelligence and resourcefulness, but they also highlighted how isolated and vulnerable she felt in our house. Rather than feeling safe enough to confide in the adults who were supposed to protect her, she was implementing her own security protocols like a prisoner trying to evade a guard. The fact that she felt compelled to protect herself from someone in her own family home spoke to a level of betrayal and violation that went far beyond simple privacy invasion. The diary entries from Emma's final weeks with us revealed her growing certainty about David's identity as her stalker, along with her desperate attempts to gather definitive proof before taking action. She'd begun leaving subtle traps in her room, such as arranging objects in specific patterns that would reveal if they'd been moved or photographed. She'd started keeping track of David's work schedule and comparing it with times when intrusions occurred, building a timeline that clearly established his opportunity and access. Emma's detective work had led her to discover that David had been taking photos of her belongings, particularly her more personal items like underwear and diary entries she'd occasionally left on her desk. She'd found evidence that he'd been accessing her phone when she left it charging in common areas, reading her text messages, and examining her photos. Most horrifyingly, she'd realized that he'd been coming into her room while she slept, a violation so profound and terrifying that she'd begun barricading her door at night and sleeping with a knife under her pillow. The final weeks of entries revealed Emma's transition from victim to investigator as she worked to build a case against David that would be strong enough to ensure consequences for his behavior. She'd begun researching legal definitions of stalking and harassment, trying to understand whether David's actions constituted crimes that could be prosecuted. She'd contacted resources for victims of sexual harassment, seeking advice about evidence collection and reporting procedures without revealing her specific situation. Emma's preparation for confronting David showed remarkable courage and maturity for someone who'd just turned 17. She'd been planning to approach our parents first, wanting to ensure she had family support before taking formal action against their daughter's husband. She'd been gathering copies of all her documentation, planning to present a comprehensive case that would be difficult to dismiss or minimize. She'd even researched the local police department's procedures for handling domestic stalking cases, preparing herself for the possibility that formal charges might be necessary. The final entry, dated the day before Emma's disappearance, revealed her decision to gather one final piece of evidence: before moving forward with her planned confrontation. She'd discovered that David kept a collection of photos on his personal laptop, stored in a hidden folder that she'd accidentally found while using his computer for a school project. Emma had been unable to access the folder during her initial discovery, but she'd planned to attempt entry again when she had more time and privacy to investigate thoroughly. Emma's final entry described her plan to access David's laptop during her lunch break from school, when he would be at work and I would be in meetings that would prevent me from coming home unexpectedly. She'd figured out his password by observing his typing patterns over several weeks, and she felt confident that she could gather the evidence she needed and return to school without anyone knowing about her investigation. Her final written words expressed determination mixed with fear, acknowledging that she was about to cross a line that would change everything but feeling certain that the truth needed to be exposed regardless of the consequences. Reading Emma's final entry while sitting in the living room where she'd planned her last investigation felt like experiencing her disappearance in real time. I could picture her sitting at our kitchen table during breakfast that final Tuesday morning, mentally rehearsing her plan while maintaining normal conversation with David and me. She'd been carrying the weight of months of violation and fear while appearing perfectly normal on the surface, protecting us from knowledge that would have shattered our sense of security and happiness. The timeline Emma had documented explained everything about her disappearance that had previously seemed mysterious. She'd attended her morning classes normally because her plan required waiting until lunch break to access David's laptop. She'd left school during lunch period intending to return for her afternoon chemistry test, but something had happened during her investigation that prevented her from ever making it back to complete her planned schedule. Understanding Emma's final day through the lens of her diary entries made David's behavior during the immediate aftermath of her disappearance seem even more suspicious in retrospect. He'd been remarkably calm and organized during those first crucial hours, immediately taking charge of search coordination and communication with authorities. At the time, I'd attributed his composure to his natural leadership abilities and practical mindset, but now I wondered if his efficiency stemmed from advanced knowledge of what had happened and what needed to be managed. David's insistence on handling most of the communication with police and media had seemed like protective husbandly behavior when I was too emotional to think clearly. But knowing what I now knew about his connection to Emma's disappearance, his control over information flow took on a much more sinister significance. He'd been in a position to shape the investigation's direction, influence which details received attention, and ensure that certain aspects of Emma's life and relationships remained unexplored. The realization that David had spent months comforting me through grief that he had caused felt like a betrayal so profound that it defied comprehension. Every time he'd held me while I cried about Emma's disappearance, every time he'd offered hope that she might still be found alive, every time he'd participated in search efforts and family meetings, he'd been performing a role while knowing exactly what had happened to her. The level of deception and manipulation required to maintain that performance for 8 months suggested a capacity for evil that I'd never imagined possible in someone I loved. As afternoon faded into evening, I found myself pacing through our house and seeing everything with new eyes that recognized potential crime scenes and evidence of deception. Emma's bedroom, which we'd left exactly as she'd arranged it, now seemed like a shrine to David's victim rather than a hopeful space waiting for her return. The kitchen where she'd eaten her final breakfast became the place where she'd sat across from her stalker while planning the investigation that would ultimately cost her life. Even our bedroom felt contaminated by the knowledge that David had been living normally in this space while hiding evidence of his connection to Emma's disappearance. The closet where I'd found her diary was just feet away from where we'd made love countless times since her vanishing, where we'd had intimate conversations about our grief and our hopes for the future. The disconnect between our physical and emotional intimacy and the reality of his deception was so vast that I felt nauseated by the memory of every touch and kiss we'd shared since Emma disappeared. By the time David's usual arrival time approached, I had made several crucial decisions about how to proceed with my newfound knowledge. I couldn't confront him directly without more information about what exactly had happened to Emma and what evidence might still exist. I needed to understand the full scope of his crimes before taking action that might give him opportunity to destroy additional evidence or harm me in the way he'd apparently harmed my sister. I also realized that I couldn't trust local law enforcement with this information without having a more complete picture of David's activities and potential criminal behavior. His cooperative relationship with the investigation into Emma's disappearance meant that he might have allies or sympathizers within the police department who would warn him if I made accusations without sufficient proof. I needed to build an airtight case before involving authorities who might give him advance warning or opportunities to flee. Most importantly, I understood that my safety now depended on David continuing to believe that his secrets remained hidden, and that I suspected nothing about his connection to Emma's disappearance. Any change in my behavior or demeanor might alert him to my discovery, potentially putting me in the same danger that had apparently befallen my sister. I needed to maintain perfect normalcy while secretly investigating his crimes, a performance that would require every ounce of self-control and acting ability I possessed. When David arrived home that evening, I greeted him with what I hoped appeared to be normal affection, while internally recoiling from his touch. He asked about my sick day with apparent concern, and I fabricated symptoms and recovery plans that seemed to satisfy his curiosity. We had dinner together like countless other evenings during our marriage, discussing mundane topics while I studied his face for signs of the monster Emma's diary had revealed him to be. The most terrifying aspect of that evening was how completely normal David seemed. He showed no signs of guilt, stress, or concern about his hidden secrets. He was affectionate and attentive, sharing details about his workday and expressing interest in my fictional illness and recovery. If I hadn't read Emma's diary, I would have had no reason to suspect that the man sitting across from me was anything other than the loving husband I'd married 4 years earlier. As we prepared for bed, I excused myself to use the bathroom and took the opportunity to move Emma's diary to a new hiding place in our home office, somewhere David would have no reason to access during his normal routine. I needed to keep it safe while I figured out my next steps, but I also needed it to remain accessible for further study and potential evidence preservation. The weight of being the only person who knew the truth about Emma's disappearance felt crushing. But it also came with a responsibility to ensure that David faced justice for whatever he'd done to her. Lying in bed next to my husband while knowing what I now knew about his true nature felt like the longest and most terrifying night of my life. Every sound he made seemed potentially threatening. Every movement in his sleep made me wonder if he was truly unconscious or planning some action against me. I remained awake for hours, listening to his breathing and planning my investigation while trying to appear normally relaxed and unaware. As dawn approached, I realized that my life had been permanently divided into 2 distinct periods. The 4 years when I'd been married to David Chen, loving husband and supportive partner, and whatever came next, now that I knew I was actually married to David Chen, stalker and likely killer of my 17-year-old sister. The transition between these 2 realities would require me to become someone I'd never been before, a detective, a spy, and potentially a woman seeking justice for crimes that had been committed under my own roof, while I remained completely oblivious to my sister's suffering and danger. The opportunity to search David's laptop came sooner than I'd anticipated. 3 days after discovering Emma's diary, David received a call from his mother in Seattle, announcing that his father had suffered a mild heart attack and was being hospitalized for observation. Within hours, he was packing an overnight bag and booking a flight, explaining that he needed to be there to support his mother and help coordinate his father's care with the medical team. I accompanied him to the airport, playing the role of supportive wife, while internally celebrating the chance to investigate without fear of interruption. As I kissed him goodbye at the security checkpoint, I wondered if this was how victims' families felt when they unknowingly helped their loved ones' killers maintain their facades of normalcy. David promised to call when he landed and expressed gratitude for my understanding about the sudden trip, mentioning that family emergencies had a way of putting life's other problems into perspective. The irony of his comment wasn't lost on me as I drove home alone, finally free to pursue the investigation that Emma had started, but never completed. For the first time in days, I felt like I could breathe properly without the constant performance of marital contentment weighing down every gesture and expression. The house felt different in David's absence, less like a potential crime scene, and more like the sanctuary it had been before Emma's diary shattered my sense of security. David's laptop sat on his desk in our home office, the same computer that Emma had planned to access during her lunch break on the day she disappeared. I approached it with the same mixture of determination and terror that she must have felt, knowing that whatever I found would either confirm or disprove the suspicions that had been tormenting me since reading her final diary entry. My hands trembled as I opened the laptop and waited for the login screen to appear. Emma had documented David's password in her diary, noting that he used a combination of his college graduation year and his mother's maiden name. She'd observed him typing it numerous times during their Thursday evening calculus sessions when he'd needed to access online resources for homework help. The password worked on the first attempt, granting me access to David's digital life with an ease that felt almost anticlimactic given the magnitude of what I hoped to discover. Initially, everything on David's laptop appeared completely normal. His desktop contained the usual collection of work files, family photos, and software applications that I'd expected from someone in his profession. His browser history showed searches related to architectural projects, news websites, and online shopping for household items. His email accounts contained routine correspondence with colleagues, family members, and service providers. For a brief moment, I wondered if Emma's suspicions had been incorrect, and if I was about to destroy my marriage based on teenage paranoia rather than actual evidence of wrongdoing. But Emma had been thorough in her investigation, and her diary had provided specific guidance about where to look for the hidden folder she'd discovered. Following her instructions, I navigated to David's photo library and began searching for files that didn't appear in the main directory but might be accessible through advanced search functions. The process required patience and technical skills that I hadn't realized I possessed, but Emma's detailed notes made the investigation manageable even for someone with limited computer expertise. The hidden folder revealed itself after nearly an hour of systematic searching through file structures and metadata. It was labeled with an innocuous name that would never attract attention during casual computer use, but the creation date corresponded exactly with the period when Emma had first started documenting intrusions into her privacy. My heart raced as I opened the folder and saw dozens of image files organized by date, spanning the entire 6 months of Emma's residence in our house. The photos were exactly what Emma's diary had prepared me to find, but seeing them with my own eyes felt like being physically assaulted by evidence of David's systematic violation of my sister. The images documented every aspect of Emma's private life in our house, from photos of her belongings arranged in her bedroom to pictures of her personal items like underwear and diary pages. The progression of photos showed increasing boldness and invasiveness, with later images clearly taken while Emma was sleeping or showering. Some of the most disturbing photos had been taken from angles that suggested David had hidden cameras in Emma's bedroom and bathroom, devices that would have allowed him to monitor her constantly without requiring physical presence during his stalking activities. The technical quality and positioning of these images indicated a level of premeditation and sophistication that went far beyond opportunistic boundary crossing. This was systematic sexual harassment and stalking that had required significant planning, equipment, and ongoing maintenance. The timestamps on the photos corresponded perfectly with Emma's diary entries about feeling watched and violated. Every incident she documented, every time she'd sensed that someone had been in her room or that her belongings had been disturbed, was represented in David's collection, with photographic evidence of his intrusions. The correlation between Emma's experiences and David's documentation was so precise that it eliminated any possibility of coincidence or misunderstanding about the nature of his behavior. Beyond the violation of photographing Emma's private spaces and belongings, the hidden folder contained images that suggested David had been planning an escalation of his stalking behavior. The most recent photos taken in the weeks immediately before Emma's disappearance showed her sleeping in increasingly revealing nightwear and positions. Some images appeared to have been taken from inside her bedroom while she was unconscious, suggesting that David had been entering her room regularly while she slept, possibly drugging her to ensure she remained unaware of his presence. The final photos in the collection were dated the morning of Emma's disappearance, showing her breakfast routine and preparations for school, with a level of detail that suggested David had been monitoring her activities in real time. These images had timestamps that corresponded with when he should have been at work, indicating that he'd either called in sick or left his office to return home and document Emma's final morning in our house. As I scrolled through David's photographic documentation of his stalking behavior, I began to understand the true scope of Emma's victimization and the calculation behind David's crimes. This wasn't impulsive harassment or casual boundary violation, but a systematic campaign of sexual predation that had been ongoing for months. The progression of photos showed increasing aggression and invasiveness, suggesting that David had been building towards some form of physical assault or abduction that Emma's investigation had inadvertently precipitated. The hidden folder also contained other files that painted an even more disturbing picture of David's psychological state and criminal intentions. Text documents revealed his detailed observations about Emma's daily routine, her emotional state, and her relationships with friends and family. These files read like a stalker's manual, documenting everything from her menstrual cycle to her sleeping patterns to her academic stress levels. The clinical tone of these observations made David's behavior seem even more predatory and calculating. Among the text files, I discovered what appeared to be David's plans for escalating his relationship with Emma from stalking to physical assault. He'd researched methods for incapacitating victims without leaving evidence, locations for isolating someone without attracting attention, and techniques for disposing of evidence after committing serious crimes. The progression of his research suggested that he'd been planning to abduct and assault Emma, possibly killing her to prevent her from reporting his crimes. The most chilling discovery was a detailed timeline that David had created for Emma's final day, showing his awareness of her school schedule, her plan to return home during lunch break, and the window of opportunity he would have for confronting her about her investigation into his activities. The timeline included contingency plans for various scenarios, suggesting that David had been prepared for the possibility that Emma might discover his stalking behavior and attempt to gather evidence against him. Reading David's own documentation of his crimes while sitting in the house where they'd been committed felt like experiencing Emma's terror and violation in real time. Every detail he'd recorded, every photo he'd taken, every plan he'd made represented a moment when my sister had been in danger, while I remained completely oblivious to her situation. The guilt of not protecting her was overwhelming, but it was overshadowed by rage at the man who had systematically victimized her under my own roof. The evidence on David's laptop also revealed the sophisticated nature of his deception and manipulation. He'd maintained detailed records of his interactions with Emma during their tutoring sessions, documenting her emotional responses and vulnerabilities to better exploit them during his stalking activities. He'd used information gathered during seemingly innocent conversations to plan his intrusions, timing them to coincide with her most private and vulnerable moments. David's files also showed his awareness of my work schedule and travel obligations, indicating that he'd been manipulating our household routine to create opportunities for stalking Emma without my knowledge. The months when I'd been working late and traveling frequently weren't coincidental, but had been engineered by David through subtle influence over my professional obligations. He'd volunteered me for projects and encouraged me to accept assignments that would keep me away from home during peak stalking periods. The realization that David had been manipulating my career to facilitate his crimes against Emma added another layer of betrayal to an already overwhelming situation. Not only had he victimized my sister and deceived me about his true nature, but he'd also sabotaged my professional life to create opportunities for his predatory behavior. The months of stress and overwork that I'd attributed to demanding clients and professional growth had actually been orchestrated by my husband to isolate his teenage victim. As I continued investigating David's laptop, I discovered evidence that Emma wasn't his first victim. Hidden deeper in his file system were photos and documents related to other young women, including some who appeared to be significantly younger than Emma. The dates on these files suggested that David had been engaging in stalking behavior for years, possibly throughout our entire marriage, and potentially even before we met. The scope of David's criminal behavior was staggering in its breadth and duration. He'd apparently been living a double life for years, maintaining the facade of a loving husband and responsible citizen, while systematically victimizing young women through stalking, harassment, and possibly worse crimes. The evidence suggested that he'd refined his techniques over time, becoming increasingly sophisticated in his methods, and more careful about avoiding detection. Some of the older files contained what appeared to be trophies from previous victims, including personal items that he'd stolen, and photographs that he'd taken without consent. The clinical organization of these materials suggested that David viewed his victims as objects to be collected and cataloged rather than human beings deserving of dignity and respect. The psychological profile that emerged from his digital footprint was that of a serial predator who had been operating undetected for years. The discovery that Emma was likely not David's first victim made her disappearance seem even more tragic and preventable. If he'd been caught and prosecuted for his earlier crimes, she would never have been placed in danger. The system's failure to detect and stop David's pattern of predatory behavior had directly contributed to Emma's victimization and disappearance. Among David's files, I found evidence of his research into Emma's family background and psychological profile. He'd apparently chosen her as a target based partly on her vulnerability as a teenager living away from her parents, but also because of her close relationship with me. Notes in his files suggested that victimizing Emma provided him with additional satisfaction because of the trust her family had placed in him and the access her residence in our home had provided. David's documentation revealed that he'd viewed Emma's living situation as an ideal opportunity for extended stalking and grooming, without the usual constraints of limited access or parental supervision. He'd exploited our family's trust and Emma's gratitude for our hospitality to create conditions that facilitated his crimes. The calculated nature of his exploitation made his behavior seem even more heinous and unforgivable. The evidence also showed that David had been preparing for the possibility that Emma might discover his activities and attempt to report his behavior. He'd researched methods for discrediting teenage victims, techniques for creating reasonable doubt about stalking allegations, and strategies for maintaining community support during criminal investigations. His preparation suggested that he'd been planning to destroy Emma's credibility if she attempted to expose his crimes. Most disturbingly, David's files contained what appeared to be plans for permanently silencing Emma if she became too persistent in her investigation or too credible in her accusations. The research included information about making disappearances appear voluntary, creating false evidence of mental health problems or risky behavior, and ensuring that investigations would focus on victim culpability rather than perpetrator actions. The methodical nature of these plans suggested that Emma's disappearance might have been premeditated, rather than a spontaneous response to her discovery of his stalking behavior. As I delved deeper into David's digital footprint, I began to understand the true timeline of Emma's disappearance and the events that had led to her vanishing. The evidence suggested that David had become aware of Emma's investigation into his activities before she'd gathered enough evidence to expose him. His own files documented his discovery of her attempts to access his laptop and his realization that she was building a case against him. David's response to Emma's investigation had been swift and decisive. Rather than attempting to gaslight her or discredit her discoveries, he'd apparently chosen to eliminate the threat she represented through her permanent disappearance. The files suggested that he'd confronted Emma when she returned home during her lunch break on that final Tuesday, possibly catching her in the act of accessing his laptop, or immediately after she'd discovered the photographic evidence of his crimes. The lack of detailed documentation about Emma's actual disappearance in David's files suggested that he'd been careful not to create evidence that could be used against him in a criminal investigation. However, the presence of research about body disposal and evidence destruction, combined with the timeline of her vanishing, painted a clear picture of what had likely occurred during those crucial hours when Emma had failed to return to school for her chemistry test. Understanding the probable sequence of events surrounding Emma's disappearance made David's behavior during the subsequent investigation seem even more manipulative and evil. He'd apparently murdered my sister to protect himself from exposure, then spent months comforting me through grief that he had caused while actively participating in efforts to find her. The level of psychological manipulation required to maintain the deception was staggering in its cruelty and calculation. As evening approached and David's scheduled call time neared, I realized that I now possessed enough evidence to expose his crimes and potentially prove his connection to Emma's disappearance. The challenge would be preserving this evidence while ensuring my own safety and building a case strong enough to guarantee his prosecution and conviction. The digital files provided clear proof of stalking and harassment, but connecting David definitively to Emma's disappearance would require additional investigation and possibly physical evidence that he might have hidden elsewhere. I spent the remaining hours before David's call carefully copying his files to multiple secure locations, including cloud storage accounts that he couldn't access and external drives that I could hide outside our house. The process of documenting his crimes was emotionally devastating but necessary for ensuring that justice could be served regardless of what happened to me during the investigation. When David called from Seattle that evening, I forced myself to sound normally concerned about his father's condition and supportive of his need to stay longer if necessary. He mentioned that his father was stable, but that his mother needed emotional support during the recovery period. I encouraged him to take whatever time was needed, privately grateful for the additional opportunity to investigate without surveillance or performance pressure. After ending the call with David, I spent hours researching my legal options and developing a plan for exposing his crimes while protecting my own safety. The evidence I'd gathered was overwhelming, but would need to be presented carefully to ensure that David couldn't destroy additional evidence or harm other potential victims before being arrested. The investigation had transformed me from victim sister to amateur detective, a role that I'd never imagined myself capable of playing but that seemed essential for achieving justice for Emma. The weight of being the only person who knew the truth about Emma's disappearance and David's true nature felt crushing, but it also came with the responsibility to ensure that her story was told and her killer was held accountable. As I prepared for the next phase of my investigation, I realized that uncovering the truth about what had happened to Emma was only the beginning of a much longer process of seeking justice and rebuilding my life after discovering that everything I'd believed about my marriage and my safety had been an elaborate lie. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.